thing that has got many of you, talking, having debates and having conversations is where the finance minister talks about having turned the corner. This morning, we're joined by Joe Jackson, who's Director of Operations at Dalex Finance, and Professor Godfred Bokpin, Professor of Finance at the University of Ghana Business School. Thank you very much, Professor Bokpin and Joe Jackson, for joining us.
Morning. Good morning.
Thank you very much, and good morning.
Joe Jackson.
Prof, good morning. Good to be on the show with you.
Yes, it's always a pleasure listening to you.
So let me start off with you, Joe Jackson, and I mean, I've seen that post of yours. I mean, the finance minister says we're gone past our most difficult moments. You disagree?
It's a tough one for me to agree to.
Okay.
And
why?
I base this on just one look at it. At the beginning of this year, in our darkest moment, when we hadn't signed the IMF bailout, and we hadn't completed the domestic debt exchange program, etc., he estimated that growth in this economy would be 2.8%. Yesterday, he revised that estimate to 1.5%.
Okay.
At that time, he said they'll be able to bring down inflation to 18.9%. Yesterday, his estimate was 31.3%. At that time, he said our gross reserves, which is the money we have there to be able to buy imports, and look at how much of an importing country we are. At that time, he said the target was going to be 3.3 months. Now he says 0.8 of a month. And I could go on. Non-oil GDP growth, he said it will be 3%. Now he's estimating it at 1.5%. If you look at it, all the major macroeconomic parameters that he set for us in January, he's worsened it for the end of the year. That doesn't sound to me like we've turned the corner. That sounds to me like things are going to get tougher before they get better. So it's a tough one for me to say that we've turned the corner. In addition, there's so many things that are huge risks that we are facing. I mean, inflation is stubborn, absolutely stubborn, in the 40s, and refuses to come down. And I was hoping they would address the issue of food inflation. They will address the issue of whether the monetary policy tools being used by the central bank are working. We've increased in the monetary policy rate all the way to 30%. And yet inflation is not coming down. I was hoping that he would have given us another path, another strategy that will be employed to bring, because inflation is what you feel it in your pocket. When you go and buy a piece of frozen chicken, you feel it. When you go and buy rice, you feel it. When you go and buy oil, you feel it. You buy drugs for your child, you feel it. So these are real issues.
Okay. Let me just bring in Professor Bokpin. I mean, as Professor of Finance, I just want to get his views on that also. I'll get back to you because you've raised questions about what we feel, and I'll also be asking you questions about what the Finance Minister believes, is being done. But Professor Bokpin, I mean, in the past you've complained. Yes, inflation, the target was at 18.9, but the reality is that by end of year 2022, inflation was at 54%. Today is at 42.5%. And we've seen it going down, even though it's going up a little bit now. But the exchange rate, relatively stable. Isn't that an indication that we're past our worst moments?
Thank you very much. I agree 100% with Mr. Joe Jackson. Of course, we can look at the same data and see some relative stability. As to whether that signal, you can interpret that signal to mean we have turned the corner, is problematic.
Why is it problematic?
Look at it this way. I'm looking at the posture of government 8 months ago when they were presenting the substantive budget 2023. They were, in finance or economics, we say they were bullish. They were aggressively confident of how they were going to turn things around. So they set targets to reflect that. 8 months down the line, instead of improving on those targets, we have revised them to reflect a certain posture now that things are actually not going to go the way we had expected. I think we should have admitted. One of the problems you see with this administration the last 3 years is that they are overly confident and bent on pushing a certain storyline which doesn't reflect reality, and consistently it betrays them. And I think that is not good.
Okay.
I'm saying it's not good because, you see, people plan. You know, the budget is an important tool and input in decision-making for private sector, households, even our development partners. So if the government, because if you run your business, okay, you may not have the capacity to be able to forecast inflation, which will also feed into your pricing, either pricing for goods or services or even for wage negotiation. So if the government, with access to all available data, says that they will be able to bring inflation down to 18.9%, of course, it's very difficult to get it exactly right. But the margin of error should give some comfort to stakeholders. Look at the variance between the target and now the revise. That is problematic.
Okay.
And that is not helpful. It doesn't help in building policy credibility. And I think, and if you look at the history of the MPP, this is one characteristic of the MPP.
Yeah, but Prof, I mean, while you may also argue that it doesn't build policy credibility, you also may want to look at where we were. Yes, he's been overly ambitious, but the reality today is that from 54% to 42.5%, I mean, it rose to 54%, and then we've been able to bring it down to 42%. Doesn't that in itself tell you that going forward, we can now achieve the 31% that he talks about?
That's what I'm saying, that if you were doing your modeling, forecasting, projection, you need to be realistic. We are talking about 8 months down the line.
Sure.
The IMF had projected growth for us of 1.5% way back. We said we're going to do 2.8%. But, of course, one cannot run away from the fact that with the IMF program, the inflows of the 600 million, we've seen some stability. But this relative stability, but listen, this is also so because the economy is not in full gear. The economy is not in full gear because we are not honoring important obligations. So the stability
What are these important obligations you make reference to?
We have suspended debt servicing on our external debt.
Okay.
We are not honoring, or we are not in optimal position with all payment to arrears, contractors, independent power producers, all important stakeholders within the economy. So if you have suspended that, your economy is not in full gear. So if you see some stability and you interpret that to mean you have turned the corner, you may be surprised if pressures from all this begin to mount and crystallize. Then you will see that the stability you are talking about is actually not durable.
Okay.
That is the point that I'm making, that we have seen some stability. particularly with exchange rates, it's not sustainable. It's also because your economy is not in full gear. So what that would tell me is that we need to be careful and handle the stability we are seeing with care.
Is it your expectation? No. Is it your expectation that if the economy gets into full gear, these relative stability that we're experiencing will change?
Yes,
and
they will change.
Okay. And see a further depreciation of the cedi?
And in fact, Winston, that has been Ghana's problem for a very long time. Sometimes when we are under IMF program, we operate certain austerity that beyond the program we cannot continue. And therefore, when we unwind, the stability that the program guarantees then becomes unsustainable.
Okay.
This is the problem. So, for instance, look, arrears to school feeding, arrears to contractors all over the place. And then Winston, the other thing I feel the minister didn't tell us enough is that this relative stability we are seeing is coming at a great cost we have never seen in our life before. This is coming at a price that is beyond what we could pay. This stability we want to celebrate has impacted the balance sheet of households, individuals, private sector, and even it didn't spare the central bank.
Okay.
Have you seen the balance sheet of the central bank?
I have.
This is the price the central bank has to pay for Ghana to have breathing space. And today, the central bank's total liability exceeds total assets. Its equity is hugely negative. This is the bank of last resort. The bank of last resort is actually in need of a bailout, probably from a government that is already in a bailout arrangement with the IMF. We can say, yes, some recovery, but it's coming at a great cost. If you put all these things together, it gives you an idea that the recovery will be slow and it will be painful.
Okay. Let me just bring in, please hold on. Let me bring in Joe Jackson in at this point. We'll get into other areas where you expected the finance minister to have addressed that he didn't address. But Joe Jackson, I mean, we've talked about a reduction in expenditure. The finance minister says we're reducing expenditure. He's talked about how, yes, our revenue targets were not met for the first half of the year, but we also did not exceed our expenditure targets. He's talked about a reduction in expenditure by some 20 billion Ghana cedis. Is that not on a good note?
On the surface, it sounds fantastic, but there are some worrying elements.
Tell me.
First of all, we increased salaries.
Yes.
That is a worrying element. But even more important, the finance minister didn't tell us how much has been incurred this year and not paid. Arrears incurred this year and not paid. You see, it's not just a simple matter of having spent. But there are people who have come to the government and say, you owe me, you owe me, you owe me, contractors, etc. So it would have been interesting if he had said, not only have we spent less, but we've also reduced or kept the level of the arrears the same. Because truly, if you tell me this month that you have spent less and you haven't included the shares that you bought on credit, which is due next month, then I won't agree with you. Because you've incurred a debt, and so and the worrying part is that you're not paying any of those bills, and they're piling up. So it's okay to say I've reduced this, I've done that, and there's been relatively no infrastructure spent.
Now, let's just put the figures to it. Let's just put the
And the
figures to
side of
it.
government that worries us are the SOEs and the size of the central government itself. Ministers, appointees, special assistants.
So
and so the cost of salaries to the public sector is growing, it's not falling.
Yes, so the cost of salaries within the public sector, and let me just put figures to it. So, for instance, in the first half of the year, we had a revenue target of 64.7 billion. We raised 59.3 billion. So that's 8.4% below the target. But within that period also, we anticipated an expenditure of 92.9 billion compared with an expenditure of 68.5 billion. Now, that is 26.3% below the programmed expenditure. But the issue here, talking about wages and salaries, the minister admits that all revenue items were within their limits except wages and salaries, which we know based on a 30% increase in base pay. And then talks about goods and services. Isn't he being realistic here? We all saw what happened when organized labor asked for these, Joe Jackson.
But you see, you forget that in the middle of all this, at that level of expenditure, we're going to borrow another 60 billion this year. Our deficit was going to be 60 billion. So maybe that deficit has been cut, but it's not zero. And there are still worrying signs. I tell you why I'm worried.
Tell me.
We haven't finished negotiating with the foreign debtors. We don't know exactly where that will land us. We haven't finished negotiating with the independent power producers. And in fact, the energy sector debt is creeping up again. And with the independent power producers, we can't go about it the way we have done in the past, because they have the ability to flip a switch and we end up in darkness. And in fact, they are threatening as we speak. There's also something that is deeply worrying. It is the rising cost of local debt. It is the rising cost of T-bills. And Monday's on Friday's auction preceding the cost of a T-bill has gone all the way up to 30% plus. This is in an economy where the government says that the long-term, the long-term rate that it can afford to pay is between 11 and 13%. Look at where the domestic debt exchange ended up, 11%. Look at where the cocoa deals have ended up, 13%. How can we be accumulating short-term debt at 30%? How can we, and so if we are worried about the rising cost, this is one of them. And this is even, as we are using treasury bills, which is basically short-term financing to do long-term things. That's a great source of worry. And until the government starts to bring down the rising cost of short-term debt, we have to be worried. It's easy to look at the numbers and say, but at January this year, short-term debt was at 35%, and now it's come down to 30%.
Yes.
But flip it. In March, it had dropped to 18 plus 19. And it's come all the way from 18, 19 back to 30 and rising. Shouldn't that be a source of worry? Shouldn't we be able to, because then if you just compare the beginning of the period and the end of the period, it may seem like we've got some relative turnaround. But there's consistent rising cost since it flattened out at 18, 19% in March. So Shouldn't that be a source of worry for all of us? And can we continue accumulating debt for this? And will it not, as we accumulate this debt, are we not reversing all the benefits we got out of the domestic debt exchange? These are some of the worries that we have. And that's why we say, in as much as a lot of good has happened, hey, we got the IMF bailout done. We got some stability in. But it may be too positive a spin to say we've turned the corner. It may not be preparing Ghanaians for the difficult road ahead if we tell them we've turned the corner.
Okay.
It may just be difficult for everybody to plan if the headline is that we've turned the corner, and yet the numbers say something very different. The trends say something very different. They show that we still have a source of worry.
Okay. Well, this morning we're joined by Joe Jackson, who's Director of Operations of Dalex Finance, and Professor Godfred Bokpin, Professor of Finance at the University of Ghana Business School. We're discussing the review of the 2023 budget as presented by the Finance Minister yesterday in Parliament. Professor Bokpin, I mean, one interesting thing. Now, you've looked at, we've talked about our GDP growth being, revised to 1.5%. It was 2.8%. Now, this is a country whose population growth per year is at 2.1%.
Yeah.
If you were to look at the population growth alone, compared, for instance, even to our GDP growth for 2023, what does that tell you? Are we better off or we've become poorer?
No, it tells you the economy technically is in recession.
Oh, okay.
Once the rate of population growth exceeds the rate of GDP growth, then in GDP per capita terms, your economy is in recession.
So this is an economy in recession, and that cannot be said to have turned the corner, is what you're saying.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying, that we agree with the minister that we've seen some level of relative stability, that the signal is there. But whether you could interpret that signal to mean you have turned the tide or you've turned the corner, that is problematic. That's what I'm saying, that you then need to look at all the variables. Remember, the economy is not just exchange rate. Of course, the exchange rate is also a reflection of the fundamentals. But even if you look at subdued import activity, traffic at the port has gone down, and all of that, we are not making payments on our external debt. That preserves FX. We are also not making payment to the independent power producers the way we should, because all this has implications for our reserves and all of that. If you look at all of that, together with the rising, in fact, Mr. Joe Jackson made a point. If you look at the interest cost build up from money market instruments, that is worrying. That perhaps may be offsetting whatever gains we are making from the domestic debt deficit. And it's simply because the government, through the domestic debt exchange, was trying to introduce a new yield curve. Okay. That was what Mr. Joe Jackson was also talking about. The below 15%. As you can see now, that yield curve is difficult to enforce. Also because inflation is very high. In our part of the world, the relationship among inflation, interest rate, and exchange rate is very strong. And therefore, once government was introducing that new low yield curve at a time when inflation was that high, then it was going to be difficult for that new yield curve to work. And they made the attempt, actually, of dragging down the treasury bill rate in order to give meaning to the new yield curve, because the new yield curve reflects medium to long term. If medium to long term rate is lower than the short term rate, the yield curve is not normal. Okay. And so you could see that we've practically abandoned that yield curve, and now we are on a different path. That is problematic. So you will need to look at all the variables, and then you will be able to conclude that, yes, they are all turning for positive.
Okay.
And therefore, we have turned the corner. Let me give you another example. A couple of weeks ago, the Monetary Policy Committee of Bank of Ghana, is that okay?
Yes.
Had the opportunity to comprehensively review the economy, largely, both fiscal, monetary, all of that. And they concluded that the risk, the balance of the risk, was more towards inflation. And therefore, they decided to increase the policy rate by 50 basis points to 30%. This is a reflection. This is the understanding of the central bank. Do you get the point?
Sure.
So it's the same economy. It's the same economy. So, yes, I know that if you are, as a manager, you are in a hurry, especially when you see positive news, you want to be able to convey that to the market. And it's also good, because managing the economy is also about managing expectations. But we need to be very careful, because the data broadly must support the conclusion.
Okay.
And under this circumstance, I think that we are not out of the woods yet. That's my considered view.
Great. Now,
at the same time, I acknowledge that we've seen some progress. We've seen the effect of the IMF program. We've seen the impact of the fiscal consolidation. But we also need to bear in mind that if we are talking about recovery, that recovery must respond to poverty dynamics, inequality, must respond broadly, must preserve fiscal space for the private sector. Because if you see, the private sector, they're overburdened with taxes. Ghanaians are overburdened with taxes. That is not the only thing. The domestic debt exchange has also impaired the balance sheet of households and private sector. It didn't even spare Bank of Ghana. If you put all these things together, it tells you that, as I said earlier, the recovery will be slow. It will be costly.
Great. Before we go for a break, Professor Bokpin, I was asking Joe Jackson the same question. When we come back, then we'll look at the monetary policy, because Joe Jackson has a lot to say, and some of the things you would have expected to hear from the finance minister also. But we've talked about a reduction in expenditure, cutting down on expenditure. The minister has reported today that we've reduced our total expenditure for the year from 227 billion to 206 billion. Good news? Hello, Professor Bokpin? Yes.
No. You know what? It's not every expenditure the country should cut. There are some expenditure cuts that will hurt growth.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are some expenditure cuts that will promote growth.
Okay.
If you look at the IMF supported program, the planned expenditure cuts under the program are the ones that will hurt growth. The kind of expenditure cuts Ghana desperately needs, the political class don't want to do that. And therefore, when we cut down on capex, which is rather critical to stimulate growth, we use that one as the headline story. When we limit wage bill, we limit hiring, and therefore we make fiscal savings, or we rationalize goods and services budgets and make savings, then we say that, we are making progress on expenditure cuts. No. Those expenditure cuts, because there's conventional wisdom for government to spend to stimulate growth. And we are clear on that. And we will support government if they spend in those lines. But the huge governance costs, which inhibit growth, those are the areas we want the expenditure cuts to go. But so far, government in negotiating the IMF supported program have preserved all those expenditure lines. And therefore, we sacrifice that which should have been scaled up, okay, in order to promote growth. And that is why you see some economists will talk about the fact that we are not even spending optimally to stimulate growth. So for them, they may not buy into the idea that you are cutting expenditure. But the idea is that the kind of expenditure you cut and the kind of expenditure you increase matters for growth. And Ghana has chosen the wrong approach. Okay. That is unfortunate. Okay? Because if we are not reforming state-owned enterprises in order to make fiscal savings from that, and central government costs across ministries, department, agencies remain elevated as we have it here, then it doesn't matter the level of taxes you impose. It will still not amount to much in promoting growth spending. And that is why, Winston, we are saying that it is not entirely true that Ghana has failed to develop to the level we all desire simply because we are not collecting enough tax revenue. It's not true. Because if you look at our tax to GDP ratio and you compare that to Malaysia and Singapore, you will see that the marginality is not that much. So if you do the modeling, you will see that in the last 15 years, the last 20 years, the amount of taxes we have collected relative to the size of the economy, if we were prudent and explored efficiency in our public investment management process, the development outcome would have been more desirable than what we have now.
Okay.
So it is not the case. And that is where, by design, we have a problem with the IMF supported program, where the conclusion is that low domestic revenue is to be blamed. And that is why the program design has more than 50% of the fiscal savings coming from revenue enhancement and just 2.1% coming from expenditure. And even the expenditure is not the kind of expenditure cut we had hoped. Okay. This is Ghana's problem. Okay. And that is why you can look at all this and say that, look, so far as I'm concerned, since 1992, and all the programs we've had with the IMF, you come to the conclusion that the problem is largely governance. It is the governance failures that manifest explicitly in economic mismanagement, corruption, that sends us to the farm as often as possible. If the problem is largely governance, the solution must reflect the source of the problem. But you see that, and also in the IMF supported program, the problem is largely governance, but the solution is more financial and economic.
Can you hold on for me, Prof? I mean, we'll come back and explore. Prof, please hold on 1 minute for me. We'll come back and explore all of these because the other angle to the discussion is that, post-2023 budget presentation in May, in the midst of the debt exchange, part of the argument was that we should be looking at, cutting discretionary expenditure, part of which is actually goods and services and CAPEX, capital expenditure. What has changed now? And we'll also focus on the things, for instance, the monetary policy, some of the things that Joe Jackson wanted to hear the finance minister talk more about. This morning, we're joined by Joe Jackson, Director of Operations, DLX Finance, and Professor Godfred Bokpin, who is Professor of Finance at the University of Ghana Business School. We're analyzing the minister's mid-year review as presented to Parliament yesterday. We'll be right back.
Your morning radio.
So let's get back to the conversation. And we have Joe Jackson, Director of Operations, DLX Finance, and Professor Godfred Bokpin, who is Professor of Finance at the University of Ghana Business School. Now, Professor Bokpin, before the break, you're talking about, cutting down in areas that would not promote growth, for instance. But the point is that, in December 2022, we're having a conversation. We all talked about why we didn't understand that from, capital expenditure budget of 13 billion in 2022, we're jumping to 27 billion in 2023, more than 100% increase. If there's a cut on that, What's wrong, Professor Bokpin?
So, yes, when you are operating an austerity budget, fiscal consolidation, and you scale up a budget line item that much, it raises concern whether it's in line with the broad objective.
Okay.
Okay. But if we are talking about expenditure cuts, and we were clear that not just a wholesale expenditure cut, because there are some expenditure cuts that will hurt growth. The position we are coming from is that the cost of operationalizing our democracy is too much. Across central government, general government, including ministries, departments, agencies, state-owned enterprises, is too much and it's unbearable. That is the angle we need to look at. And that is why we are calling for governance reforms, which may also entail probably revision to our constitution. The lawyers can look at that so that we begin to fashion or operationalize a kind of democracy that is sustainable.
Okay.
That does not impose so much cost on taxpayers, private sector, households, that allows private sector to continue to run their businesses and grow and expand for households to also be able to accommodate their or maximize their utility. That is the way to go without compromising our democracy. Because the way we are going, there is the urgent need to save Ghana's democracy from itself.
How?
Because the cost of operationalizing our democracy is becoming unbearable to private sector and households.
So how do we save our democracy from our democracy?
So we need to look at how we are operationalizing our democracy. We are not proposing an alternative per se, but we have to make democracy work for development.
How?
And that's why we have to look at the governance cost, serious governance reforms.
Okay.
And we have said boldly that we should get to the point where we shouldn't have more than 40 ministers. If any government thinks that they cannot govern with 40, they should step aside.
That's understood. But the point you make, let me just get back to the KPES budget here, because, yes, you say when it increases by 100%, that is problematic. And so if you agree that is problematic, you might as well, do you also agree that a cut would not be problematic?
So it's more serious if the cut is applied to the neglect of the critical expenditure cut that needed to be done to promote growth. You'll be more concerned. You are majoring on the minor.
Okay. Let me bring in Joe Jackson at this point, because Joe Jackson, you've talked about the monetary policy. Yes, now at 30%, at the last meeting increased by 50 basis points because, again, inflation had started going up and they wanted to send a signal. What is it that you're expecting the finance minister to say about that he didn't say?
Okay. Now, there are a number of things we should think about. First of all, the challenge with inflation is food. Food inflation is what is killing us.
Sure.
And that's why we all feel it so keenly, because I don't think there's anybody in this country who can avoid the cost of food. Mm-hmm. Now, the second thing is this food inflation especially is all run in the informal sector. And we already know the size of the informal sector in Ghana. So can inflation be brought down in this particular set of circumstances by addressing a monetary policy rate that mainly works through the banks? Who?
Tell me, can
in
it?
The food sector, what percentage of the food sector are actually taking any form of credit from the banks? How big is our informal sector? So I dare say that the monetary sector is punishing the formal sector without really doing anything to bring inflation down. And what some of us were hoping was that there will be some initiative, for example, to improve farm gate to market pricing for our goods. There will be some immediate initiatives that would work towards reducing the price of food in the market. That didn't happen. And how long are we going to keep increasing this monetary policy rate, which is punishing the financial sector, punishing the private sector, especially the formal part? We are now at 30%. Are we going to take it as high as 40% if inflation doesn't come down? Those are real questions. And some of us believe that we should relook at the issue of using this particular tool to fight inflation. And inflation in particular is of absolute importance. Every one of us feels the effect. The pensioners, their incomes have been eroded completely by inflation. Listen, it's a tough one. I do agree that there are very tough policy choices to be made, but some, like inflation, which affect each and every one of us, I think should be at the top, and we should be exploring alternatives to simply asking the central bank to continue to increase the monetary policy rate as a way in which to fight inflation. In any case, this is the same central bank that has been pumping out money to the government in deficit financing. So it seems like we're robbing Peter to pay Paul. Thankfully, that loophole seems to have been closed. The central bank has impaired its own balance sheet. So that is a good loophole that's been closed. But listen, the money was pumped in, and it's going to take time to clear out, especially since, as we stand, we may even look at the immediate past events of certain politicians having a lot of money in foreign currency in their households as being an indication that in addition to the large informal sector we have, we also have given an incentive to our citizens to keep cash, because everybody who's been involved in the financial sector has either had money locked down because of the financial sector cleanup, or have lost money because of a domestic debt exchange program, or have lost money because of a cocoa bond program. So really, all we're doing is giving people an incentive to keep cash out of the system.
Okay.
So long as there's so much cash out of the system, then this monetary policy thing won't work. Because it works only through the banks.
All right.
So it's time to look at it and see what we can do beyond just a simple appeal to say, take your money to the bank, but to bring back confidence so that our monetary policy can hope to work. In any case, it's not working. We should explore alternatives. Raising that monetary policy rate is not right. And it's easy for the finance minister to tell us that interest rates are falling. But the monetary policy rate has gone to 7%. I don't know which interest rates are falling.
Let me bring in Professor Bokpin at this point as we wrap up the conversation. Professor Bokpin, you think that we have to probably change our ways of increasing the monetary policy? Maybe we look at something else in our way of tackling inflation?
Well, I sympathize with the position of Mr. Joe Jackson and many Ghanaians, but I think the conceptualization is that it takes more than just monetary policy to bring inflation down. And I think that has to be clear. We have the pull and the push. So monetary policy largely can address the demand-related inflationary pressures.
Yes.
Demand-related. So the dynamics we have right now reflect the supply-side constraints or structural bottlenecks in the economy. So the part of the inflation that is as a result of this, we cannot blame that on the central bank. We will be asking too much from monetary policy perspective in addressing the issue. And that is why when the pressure mounts on the central bank, the only tool they have largely will be to increase the policy rate. And that doesn't comprehensively address the issue. The fiscal side has failed to do its part. So before we learn to the call of changing the monetary policy framework, move away from inflation targeting, we need to understand where the difficulties have come from and whether the change would actually be enough to overcome the weakness from the fiscal side. Okay, and if you see the Minister of Finance in the media review is talking about the fact that the complementarity between fiscal and monetary is something that they are going to pursue. And you can see that the motion had already been set, right, with the memorandum of understanding between the central bank and then the Ministry of Finance with the zero financing of the budget deficit. It is this fiscal dominance of monetary policy that has resulted in destroying the balance sheet of the central bank we spoke about earlier. The central bank's overexposure to the government and quasi-government institutions is what has brought them this far. Essentially, they have compromised their operational independence. They sold their birthright to the government, and the result is the balance sheet they are now presiding over. So until we get the fiscal side doing its work and complementing monetary policy, is going to be difficult. You know, Winston, under inflation targeting, one key requirement for inflation targeting to be effective is rather outside the control of the central bank. Interestingly, that is how the design is. What is that thing? For inflation targeting to be effective, you will need to guarantee the central bank fiscal discipline. Look at that. And the fiscal discipline, the monetary side don't have control over it. That is the political side of the economy. So if you deny the central bank fiscal discipline, then there is no way they will be able to deploy monetary policy effectively to bring down inflation and engineer growth. This has been Ghana's problem. So therefore, what have we done? Instead of pursuing monetary policy and fiscal policy as complementing each other, we are rather pursuing monetary policy as subordinate to fiscal policy. Let me put it in a way that we can understand. We have practically, in fact, since inflation targeting started, unofficially March 2002 and officially 2007, we have essentially used monetary policy as a broom to sweep the mess created by the fiscal side. This is all that we have been doing.
Okay.
We have pursued monetary policy as subordinate. So you see, in the balance, the central bank is a servant to the Minister of Finance. The result of that is the impaired balance sheet. Now we have to deal with.
Professor Bokpin, thank you very, very much for joining us this morning. We're very grateful to you. Of course, the conversation would continue, particularly when it comes to the Bank of Ghana and its financials. That's something we'll have to talk about later on. Thank you also, Joe Jackson, Director of Operations, Dalex Finance, for making time to speak to us this morning. We're grateful to all of you.